When building any deck in the One Piece card game, you're going to have a set of cards that you cannot move. These core cards to the deck are the cards that make the deck go around and make it function the way that it wants to. The cards that aren't core to the deck are generally going to be tech cards. Changing specific cards in your deck can increase your win rate in certain matchups by even just a few percentage points, but over the course of a 13 round day, these few percentage points can add up. Where in OP11, 6 costs were generally considered to be one of the worst cost thresholds in the game due to the fact that Blue Purple Luffy's 9 Mom could very easily remove it. Now in OP13, because Marcus Mars can get rid of cards that KO a base 5 cost or less, 6 cost cards are actually one of the best cost thresholds in the game. In this video, we're going to be going over many of the unique cards, old and new, that have suddenly become very powerful in this OP13 meta due to the way that the meta has shifted. So speaking of 6 costs, let's jump straight into those. Now, OP13 introduced a lot of new 6 costs, and I think that this is intentional. The new Secret Rare 6 cost Luffy, Ace, and Subble are all extremely powerful cards within their given decks. 6 cost Luffy, an exceptionally powerful in decks like Zoro Sanji and even some other more aggressive green decks, can be very powerful into Imu, as not only are you playing a 6 cost that won't be removed the next turn, but it also has double attack, and because of the Fordon that it gives you back, also gives you a lot of interesting ways to be able to deal with the opponent's board. This can be through playing more characters that just increase your board, or attaching Wordong to your characters or leader to hit in the opponent's board, or of course, using any sort of other removal. The 6 cost Subble works exceptionally well with the leader Subble. With your leader effect from Subble, this is actually basically a 8 cost 8000 blocker on the field, which is so powerful for this deck, and because the activate main effect can be used every single turn, in matchups where this card can't be taken out, it is exceptionally powerful. The third 6 cost secret rare of this set is Ace. This card is occasionally seen in Ace to tech for things like the Green Zoro matchup, and is also sometimes seen in Blue Yaonami, as the Don't Attach to Your Leader not only gives this leader a more aggressive angle into the game, but also lets you play defensively thanks to the leader effect being activated with that one Don't. Now, all three of these 6 costs are very good within this meta, and it's because of this Marcus Mars. Because 5 costs or less have such little value in this meta, the fastest possible thing that you can play onto the board that will actually stick in this very prevalent EMA matchup is going to be these 6 costs. While these new cards are very powerful, that doesn't mean that we haven't had some pretty strong 6 costs in the last couple of sets. 6 cost Yamato is an exceptionally powerful ace card, as not only is it very good into Imu for the fact that it's a 6 cost 7000 rush character that attaches a Dong to your leader, but because, again, it has a repeatable effect, like the 6 cost Subble, if this card remains on the board, which it likely will, it'll keep gaining value over the course of time. This is why a lot of people use the 6 cost Yamato and Ace over the 6 cost Ace, because of this activate main ability. And while all of these cards are relatively powerful cards that remain on board and will start to accrue value over the course of the game by not being able to be taken back, there's some other cards that can be very good as a 6 cost that don't exactly fit into this criteria. One of the cards that you may have seen some decks running and weren't quite sure why is the 6 cost Uta. Now, Uta is a 6 cost 4000 blocker with 2000 counter, which on its own feels like it may be a little bit worse than something like the 6 cost Sanji. However, when you have a character with 10,000 power or more on your field, this card gets -4 costs in your hand. Because this card only costs you 2 Dong to play, but on the board is a 6 cost, it makes it a very easy to use blocker, 2k counter, and very tricky for Imu to get rid of. Therefore, while Uta is the most prevalent example, things like the 6 cost Subble and also the 6 cost Sanji are also very good for this same reason. The final 6 cost that I'll be talking about in this video is one that we showed in the intro, and that is Jozu. Now, Jozu is very good for a very different reason. Against Imu, Jozu is actually not that good. Yes, it's a 6 cost 7000 that'll stick onto the board for one turn, but the on-play effect is completely useless against Imu because Imu's characters cannot be removed by effects after a very, very short period in the game. However, Jozu is relevant in this meta because of how powerful other 6 costs are. Because Jozu can bounce back a 6 cost to the opponent's hand, even if the opponent plays their powerful 6 cost, being able to answer it with Jozu just puts you in a position where your 6 cost stuck to the board and theirs simply didn't. It's for this reason that 6 costs and also answers to that 6 cost in this Jozu have become a lot more prevalent in OP13. However, of course, OP13 isn't just a meta about Ima. There are many other decks in this meta, and therefore many other cards that beat them. New day of recording, and I actually just came back from a Japanese festival in Omatsuri, and so that's why I'm wearing this. Fun fact, actually, this isn't a kimono, this is a jinbe, which is similar actually to the character jinbe. But because I went to an Omatsuri, I thought this would be a great time to get some on-site commentary on some cards within OP13. Hey guys, iKailaKai here today, talking to you from an Omatsuri about single target removal in OP13. Ace, thanks to the ability to play the 10-cost Newgate one turn ahead of time through the 8-cost event, has allowed him to play a very powerful board very early on in the game, akin to a deck like purple decks that can ramp, except he doesn't need to ramp, he just needs to have the event and a card called Edward Newgate. Now, what this means is that single target removal, although rather weak against Ima, is very powerful into Ace, because if you can get rid of this 10-cost Newgate, then the benefits of playing this 10-cost Newgate ahead of time are somewhat mitigated. Therefore, one of the strongest cards to be able to play is the 9-cost Stussy. Decks that can play this 9-cost Stussy are very good into Ace, as if you can play this on curve, especially in a deck like Red-Black Sable, the added 9,000 power stat line, as well as all of the extra damage that you get, and mitigate by being able to get rid of that potential blocker as well as damage, makes the board swing heavily in your favor for these decks. Decks like Ima have also been taking in these such cards for a similar reason, but for Ima, because you don't have the luxury of having this 9-cost Stussy stay on the board forever, as it's going to eventually disappear when you play the 10-cost Gorose, the value of this card is somewhat lower. That's why you see this card run at 4 copies in a deck like Sabo, but only at maximum 2 in a deck like Ima. Cards such as Red Rock are also seen within Ace to deal with things like the mirror and also a very specific line that can come out of Ima versus Ace. This Red Rock can be very substantial within the mirror if played at the right timing, but is generally only seen at a few copies in Ace as well. Still, these kinds of single target removal like the 9-cost Stussy, like the 6-cost Red Rock, and even some other cards like the 2-cost Vanderdecken can be very powerful in this meta if you have the right deck to facilitate that. Thank you, Kai, for that commentary. So anyways, now let's move on to... I'm not done. Sorry, what? I said I'm not done. So you see, Red Blue Ace is a deck that doesn't only function around the 10-cost Newgate. As I mentioned, one of the strongest points about it is that it plays like a ramp deck that doesn't necessarily need to ramp. As such, one of the other strongest cards in this deck is the 4-cost Marco. Now this 4-cost Marco is very powerful for one particular reason. With your leader effect, you get to draw 3 cards on KO. On top of being a blocker, this is a massive tempo swing for basically any deck fighting against Ace. What this means is that one of the best ways to deal with Marco is to simply just return it to Ace's hands. As such, bounce effects have been very powerful within this meta. It's a tale as old as time that the strongest counter to a certain color is the same color itself, but that's going to be true for OP13 as well. Now, in OP13, the 4-cost Atomos in the mirror has been very powerful to get rid of this 4-cost Marco, especially on curve, but there are some other options that other decks have been running as well. Particularly Blue-Purple Luffy has been running things like the 8-cost Luffy, and even things like the 7-cost Kiros to be able to get rid of this card very quickly. Therefore, Ace especially has had to play this very difficult balancing act of how many bounce cards do you run for the mirror, and how many non-bounce cards or rush cards do you run for things like the Ima matchup. Still, as the meta develops more, getting rid of these lower cost bodies, especially that are 4 costs and below, has become ever more prevalent and ever more important. That brings us to, finally, being able to rest these characters. Let's send it back to Kai at home. We good? Yep. We good? Yep. Yeah. 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 My show. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Go ahead. Anyways, so although bouncing Marco is a more permanent way to remove the card, it isn't necessarily the best way to get rid of a card like Warcury. Therefore, the more universal answer to these cards in particular is to just rest them, because although it is a one-turn solution, sometimes you just need that one turn, and denying the opponent from being able to block with the character, but also be able to deny multiple draws off of that card's on KO effect means that it's a pretty massive tempo swing, especially if you can rest the character multiple turns in a row. Therefore, let's look at some new resting cards that have become more prevalent in OP13 due to this new meta. Now, surprisingly, every single color except for black has a way to temporarily deal with these 4-cost or less characters. First, starting with the obvious green, the color that is known for resting, has access to some rather low-cost resting characters such as the 2-cost Sugar, as well as some higher power, higher cost characters such as the 7-cost Hody, and even some things in the middle like Dead Man's Game that are very good at dealing with these cards. Because green is the home to this resting mechanic, it has the most powerful and diverse ways of resting the opponent's characters and also their Don cards, making them the best choices into some of these decks should you look at this specific mechanic in isolation. In particular, the 2 cost Sugar in Zoro-Sanji is exceptionally good because you can keep bouncing this card back to your hand, recycling and reusing the effect over and over again. And cards like Dead Man's Game in combination with Luffy will become King of the Pirates in Green Zoro makes a very powerful and sudden lethal combo that the opponent may not be able to count for or be able to expect. In purple, we have a card that was already quite popular in previous metas due to how simply powerful the card is alongside being a 2k, the 3-cost Usachi. This card being able to rest a 5-cost less for only 3 dong is very good in this meta, and on these final turns when you're trying to go for lethal, it's going to be one of the strongest cards in these purple decks. Now, a card that's actually almost never seen any play at all that I think is suddenly very good in this meta is actually Blaze Slice. Now, Blaze Slice has never really needed to be played because the yellow decks didn't necessarily need this sort of mechanic to be able to finish out the games because a lot of yellow decks were generally just looking to play into the late game and slowly out attrition the opponent. However, in this meta where yellow needs to play a bit more aggressive, decks like NL have a difficulty surviving. So therefore, because yellow has to finish out the game on their own time, they actually need to run cards that'll speed up the pace of the game. Blaze Slice plays into this perfectly because it's essentially a 0-cost rest of 4 costs due to the plus 1000 power that you get to your leader or characters. Not only this, but because it also has the effect to be able to use on counter, it can be a surprising way to deny the opponent attacks. When the opponent is trying to go for lethal and they leave up their Marco to act as a last barrier of defense, being able to suddenly rest it will make them either have to go for lethal or die trying. The diversity of Blaze Slice and the surprise factor currently is very powerful, and I think that this card will be very strong when yellow becomes more prevalent again, but currently yellow as a whole has been struggling. Now, although these are the main cards that can rest the opponent's characters to make them null and void for the turn, that doesn't mean that it's the only way that we can deal with them. In red, some decks have been teching the card Lime Juice. Now, Lime Juice may seem a little bit odd. Because it can only target a 4000 power less character, you'd assume that it's just not necessarily good enough to play in this meta. However, because decks like Roger are running things like the 10-cost Shanks, and other red decks in general have access to power reduction, being able to run this card to just reduce the power into that 4000 power threshold to then use Lime Juice has been a way to deal with these matchups. For a deck like Roger that also has access to purple, being able to play the Usachi is generally going to be better than Lime Juice. However, Lime Juice has its benefits as well, as it can also target things like the 6-cost Uta, which has also been coming back into the meta. It's interesting how some of these tech cards are being teched for with other tech cards. The blue equivalent of these cards that can deny the opponent the ability to block with their 4-cost less characters is the blue Hina. Although the activate main effect is going to cost you 1 card, if you're going for lethal, the effect isn't too punishing. Although this card was historically only used within Kuzan because you could redraw the card you throw away, it's now even seen in decks like Blue Doflamingo to be able to deal with some of these lower cost blockers that these decks play. All of these colors, with the exception of black, have a way of dealing with the opponent's low-cost characters on the final turns, but the resting effects are still going to be the strongest, as you're not only going to have to be playing around the Ace and Imu's Warcury and Marco, but you're also going to have to consider what you're going to do with the 4-cost Zoro that comes out of Green Zoro. 4-cost Zoro at the end of the opponent's turn restands itself, so being able to rest this character and take it out is a very good option. However, a lot of these colors simply don't have a way of dealing with this 4-cost Zoro, especially if it comes out alongside the 2-cost Koshiro. Therefore, resting is the strongest effect in the game right now for these low-cost blockers, but that doesn't mean that these other cards like the blue Hina or like Lime Juice are going to be weak, because they still deal with 2 very important and powerful cards within this meta. However, instead of just dealing with 1 or 2 of these blockers, what if there was a card that could deal with all of them all at once? One of the strongest cards within the set that hasn't seen too much play in sets before is the secret rare 10-cost Roger. This 10-cost Roger, when you or your opponent are at 0 life, if the opponent blocks on any of your attacks, they lose the game. This card is used within Roger, of course, but is also seen within Red Black Subtle and Ace as a finisher. These decks, although they have very powerful board control and very powerful board presence, don't necessarily always have ways to get over Imu's massive defense line. As such, finishing the game there and then by dropping a Roger, whether or not it's ahead of time or on the turn that you want to finish out the game, is the final nail in the coffin for so many decks in this meta. Whether or not you want the game to go on longer, Roger is going to be the one to end up deciding. There are 2 more cards that I want to talk about within this video that didn't necessarily fall into a certain category because they're very unique in what they do. We've talked extensively about anti-Emu and anti-Ace tech, and because these 2 decks are the big bads of the meta, it makes sense to do so. We have talked a little bit about Zoro in the meta, but there is another deck, of course, in Roger that a lot of people are playing. A card that's very good into Roger is actually Magellan. The 5-cost Magellan has seen a bit of a comeback due to the fact that Roger relies so heavily on getting his ramp on curve. Just on doing one of these turns, or even on Tendong playing Magellan to put them back to 9, forces them into an awkward situation where even though the next turn they're going to have 10, because of their leader effect, they're forced to attach that Dong to their leader. In this way, 5-cost Magellan completely breaks the ankles of Roger, and is also quite good into Ace and Ema as well, as these decks tend to rely on their high-cost characters. Being able to delay their optimal moves by 1 or even sometimes 2 turns, depending on the number of Magellans that you can find in the early game, can be devastating for some of these matchups, as it's very tricky to take back this Magellan as well. Although it's in that dangerous 5-cost or less thresholds that we were talking about at the beginning of this video, because of the devastating on KO effect, many people, even given the option to, choose not to KO this card. It's for that reason that although we haven't seen too many decks utilizing this Magellan quite yet, it is still very powerful in this meta. The final card and the omnipresent threat of the entire One Piece card game is going to be, of course, everyone's favorite card, the 4-cost Pudding. 4-cost Pudding reshuffles the opponent's hand and makes them draw 5 cards, which has always been a very powerful effect. Basically, every single blue deck has run this card at minimum 1 copy if they can. However, in OP13, because there's so much resource generation and so much card draw, this card is so much more powerful. The reason why aces don't run too many copies of it is simply because the deck wants to play on curve and a lot of times doesn't have time to play this card. However, decks that can actually find a timing to play Pudding can completely devastate some of these matchups. Ace is a deck that even when countering hard will still end up with 8 or 9 cards in their hand. Raj is a deck that likes to take his life very early on, and Imu is a deck that will also generate resources very quickly over time, even past the Tendong turn. As such, 4-cost Pudding is exceptionally good into 3 out of the 4 most popular matchups in OP13, making it one of the scariest cards to deal with even to this day. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's a little bit different from what I usually do. Make sure to share it with other people. I think that that's actually going to help me be most over liking the video, but definitely like and subscribe as well. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I appreciate you guys watching. I will be back with some more gameplay videos. Zoro Sanji video coming up next. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.